When now life's happening and I have the actual things to be stressed out about, can I use my breath to regulate myself in those moments?
The normal range of psychological suffering is a story of telling yourself a story. You're thinking.
Part of me that's debilitated by anxiety, that, and according to Gestalt therapy, is a character that resides in me.
It's not thinking about the mountaintop. You can, by the way you breathe, you can change the electricity in your mind.
This too shall pass. That's the good and the bad. Generalized anxiety means that you have so many triggers now for your anxiety. I'll give you one of mine. This was so bizarre to me. This was when I first thought, ooh, I don't think I'm nervous. I don't think I'm a nervous person. I think this has officially reached levels of anxiety. If I turned, so I used to work in a parking garage where, you would go up to floor 5 or whatever. And every day I would just turn right, turn right, turn right, turn right, all the way down. But you could turn right or left. And I remember one day, for whatever reason, I turned left and I had this sudden spike of anxiety. And I was like, why the hell would I be anxious about turning left? And so that was when I realized, okay, whoa. Like, this isn't even now attached to any sort of major thing. This is about me overextending, doing something new, going into the unknown. And I realized that that was the beginning of the anxiety for me. That because I'm not a born entrepreneur, getting into business was this incredibly anxiety-provoking endeavor. The stakes were so high, I felt like I was constantly on stage, like it was nuts. And so I realized, oh my God, anytime I do something, quote unquote, out of my comfort zone, no matter how minor, my brain has now allowed itself to condition itself to be anxious about anything that sort of deviated from the norm. And when we boil it back down to what is anxiety? Anxiety is living in the future and worrying about it. Okay? You're mentally projecting into the future and you are worried about it. And you allow yourself, yes, allow yourself to worry. And it feels like you're doing yourself a solid because you're thinking through all the things that could go wrong. So you want to be ready. I remember I used to, I'm going to get in, this situation in a meeting or whatever, and at some point the eyes are going to turn to me. So what do I do if my heart starts racing and I'm getting panicky? What do I do about that? And I realized that I would sit there and be like, okay, I'm gonna, maybe I can say that I've got a stomach ache or a headache or something, and I'll find a way out of the room. All I was doing in those moments was rehearsing it going wrong, that I was gonna get into the situation and need an exit. And then I realized, a better approach, because all my planning to make sure that I'm ready is the thing that's making me anxious, okay? I want that to hit home. That is the thing that's making you anxious, is that you're thinking about you might get anxious.
What kind of utility or usefulness are we looking for? And what do I mean when I say this? A lot of us, when we're looking to create change, we actually want the people around us to be the ones changing. So it's kind of the radical, kind of self-responsibility ownership, the conversation I always have around boundaries. Boundaries aren't ultimatums. They're not me pointing some finger at you, Tom, and giving you, if you do this, this will happen. If you don't do this, this will happen. Boundaries are for self-empowerment. So I answer and I think about things in the same context, right? What am I what pattern am I owning here? What role am I playing? And how can I create change, whether or not you're being an active agent or an active player as well. And sometimes this means being radically honest with ourselves and exploring what our intentions are, what our behaviors are, and how we're participating in the pattern, even in the moments where we're pretty much convinced it's not us. So I think a lot of times it's that deep level of self-exploration that can give us clarity on that.
Generally, just learning about how feelings work was very helpful. The guy I've been working with for the last 6 to 8 years. He does a thing called Gestalt therapy, which is very interesting. It was very big in, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, and it kind of waned, but it's really interesting. So it's, some people do call it like the empty chair work, and that's essentially Gestalt therapy. So, for instance, there's the part of me that's debilitated by anxiety. So that, and according to Gestalt therapy, is a character that resides in me. I have a lot of different, there's a chorus of voices, a chorus of characters that reside in each one of us. You simply engage in a conversation with that character. So it's this kind of, actors actually do really well with it. It's kind of like role playing. So you have myself, there's the therapist over here, and there's an empty chair. So I'm me, then I have a conversation with my anxious guy. I'm like, tell me about yourself. I remember sometimes I've been just debilitated by anxiety. I couldn't move. I was tongue-tied, sweating in panic attacks. Like, who are you, and what are you about that you kind of take me over in that way? And then you literally get up and you walk over and you sit in that other chair and you talk back to the empty chair, that guy talking back to Rain, to reasonable Rain. And that guy, you don't know what's going to come out. You don't try and plan it. You just try and it's like improv. You just step into the shoes of that person. And by the way, you can do this all with writing too. You can just do conversations by writing, and some people take to that a lot more easily. And then that guy might say, like, you know you're a piece of shit and nobody likes you, and so you're terrified of being found out as a total fraud and unlovable, and so I'm there to protect you, and if that happens, like, I'm gonna protect you, and I'm gonna seize you up, and I'm gonna overwhelm you, so that I'm just, by the way, I don't know that any of this that I'm saying is the truth. I'm just giving an example.
No, it's super helpful.
And you can do that with all of these different characters in your head, and they cease to have that as much control, because they're not these characters swimming in the sea of our unconscious that sometimes leap out with their tentacles and grab on and control us. They're much more like, oh, when you hear that voice, you start to feel the anxiety, like, oh, there's Mr. Anxiety Guy again. Or you try and control, and it's like, oh, there's my control freak. I wonder what he's trying to control. Or there's my angry reactive guy going again. It allows that kind of distance to know that I don't have to be a victim to these characters that live within me.
So now going back to our woman with postpartum depression. So she's having these thoughts. They're giving her a neurochemical cascade where she is having a physiological response to this. She's confusing the physiological response with what's actually causing this. How does she then begin to back out of that? Like, how does she, what is the process, the mood journaling and all of that is going to help her get out of this?
Well, there's two phases to it now. When I wrote Feeling Good, it was just how to crush the negative thoughts. But now
I think it's worth walking us through that. I think people understanding the sort of gist of the 10 cognitive distortions.
Well, sure, let's do that, and then maybe later we can talk about this amazing new thing that speeds recovery so much. You know, she what is she telling herself? Well, she's telling herself, it's my fault that the baby isn't nursing. I'm a failure as a mother, and also I shouldn't have mixed feelings about having a child. Mothers are supposed to just love their children. And those thoughts have all of the classic cognitive distortions. For example, should statements. I shouldn't have mixed feelings. Also, self-blame. It's my fault that the baby is having trouble nursing. That type of thing. And she had about 8 thoughts, and they all had multiple distortions. You know, all or nothing thinking, looking at things in black or white categories. Emotional reasoning is huge. A lot of people who are listening right now feel depressed and hopeless, so that they feel like losers, so they say, I must be a loser. I feel like a loser. I must be hopeless. I feel hopeless. She's also involved in mind reading, thinking, oh, other mothers don't have mixed feelings. Other mothers are, these ideal mothers. And so that's the first step, is to recognize that what you're telling yourself is not true. It's distorted. And the second thing is to realize that it's kind of mean-spirited, what you're doing to yourself.
What is anxiety? Anxiety is you are catastrophizing about the future. So I'm guessing if you're worried about going to the gym, you're thinking, oh my God, they're going to judge me. They're going to think I'm a loser. I'm fat. I'm weak. I'm skinny. I'm whatever your concern is. You've got to pattern interrupt that. You've got to stop it. You've got to focus on not what other people think about you. You've got to focus on what your goal is. And if your goal demands that you go to a gym, if you want to be more social and your goal demands that you go out and meet people, then that's what we're going to do. So we're going to do whatever we have to in order to get beyond that sense of like, this is a terrible thing. So now this is where we put our meditation in. This is where we stop our catastrophizing. We do the pattern interrupt. We start thinking about, oh man, this is going to be great. I'm not good at social stuff yet, but I'm going to get good. Tom told me action cures all, so I know I need to go do this thing. There's nothing to panic about, because the only thing that you're quote unquote panicking about is some future thing that's going to happen. But what's really going to happen? Let's say everybody judges you. They think that you are a loser. They think that you are fat. They think that you are skinny. They think that you are dumb, whatever. Now, did you die or do you survive that? And more importantly, do you get a little bit better, a little stronger, a little more resilient? It's really easy to think about when you think about going to the gym. If everyone there thinks that you are fat or skinny or whatever, but you show up to the gym every day and you put in the work, they cannot stop you from getting the result that you want. So they can throw all the shade they want, which by the way, they're not. Nobody gives a shit about anybody else, to be honest. Like, they might give you a sideways glance and think you're a loser, but they're worried about themselves. They're thinking about themselves. They're trying to look cool or feel good or be proud of themselves or move forward in their life or whatever. And the odds that they're spending any significant amount of time thinking about you is basically zero. So the great news is, no matter what they're thinking about you, they cannot stop you from getting the result that you want when you show up and put in the work. So focusing on getting a little bit better every day, that's really the goal. So whatever your goal is, it mandates certain actions. The good news is action cures all. The even better news is that you can interrupt that escalation mentally with a pattern interrupt, with a focus on the fact that you can get better, reminding yourself of empowering statements instead of disempowering statements. And then you just get to work. Just do the thing. And every time your brain starts worrying about the future, remind yourself, if I let myself sit here and think about this, this will become the easiest thought for me to think. This will become the easiest feeling for me to feel, which means that when my brain walks into a gym or a bar or whatever, I will have trained it to trigger over into this negativity.
I suffered from severe anxiety attacks. I would get anxiety attacks where I would be on the subway in New York City, like shaking, and was afraid that people were going to think that I was like a crack addict because I was like sweating. I'm kind of sweating right now, actually, but that's more from the LA weather. But I would be shaking and sweating on the subway, panicking. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. Sometimes I would just fall to the ground. These came and went for years. Sometimes they would be attached to a thing. So all of a sudden it would get attached to flying. And then I would have this terrible fear of flying. Then it would go away from flying, and then it would be enclosed spaces, and I would get it around enclosed spaces. Then it would just kind of randomly happen.
How did you, as an actor on the stage, how did you deal with that? That's got to be a pretty big trigger to literally be on stage in front of people.
Yeah. In fact, it was a big deal. It never happened on stage, but I would get that fear, that when you get that cold, chilled ice water in your veins, like heart thumping fear, like, oh shit, this thing is about to happen. I would get that terror that I was on the stage, because I did theater for 10 years before I came to LA and eventually did The Office. So I did a lot of different plays, a lot of different styles of acting characters, and I was terrified that one of these days I was going to seize up on stage, forget all my lines, and start shaking and sweating.
Do you have a guess as to why it didn't happen?
Well, I think that it's like people who stutter. Like I have a couple friends that stutter, and when they're acting, they don't stutter. They're actors who stutter. So in real life, they stutter. And when they're on stage playing characters, they don't stutter. So what is that about? There's a certain part of the brain that you're using. There's a certain consciousness and focus that you're bringing to the words that you're saying that I think allow you to not stutter and to not succumb to panic attacks.
What is up, my friend? Tom Bilyeu here, and I have a big question to ask you. How would you rate your level of personal discipline on a scale of 1 to 10? If your answer is anything less than a 10, I've got something cool for you. And let me tell you right now, discipline, by its very nature, means compelling yourself to do difficult things that are stressful, boring, which is what kills most people, or possibly scary or even painful. Now, here is the thing. Achieving huge goals and stretching to reach your potential requires you to do those challenging, stressful things and to stick with them even when it gets boring, and it will get boring, and even when you might be afraid of the outcome if you fail. Building your levels of personal discipline is not easy, but let me tell you, it pays off. In fact, I will tell you, you're never going to achieve anything meaningful unless you develop discipline. If you're not already a 10 out of a 10 with this skill, and I use that word intentionally because it is a skill, you can build it, you can get better at it. Class from Impact Theory University called How to Build Ironclad Discipline, that teaches you the process of building yourself up in this area so that you can push yourself to do the hard things that greatness is going to require of you. Promise, if you want to achieve your goals, this is the number one thing you have to focus on. As Jocko Willink says, discipline equals freedom. Right, click the link on the screen, register for this class right now, and let's get to work. I will see you inside this workshop from Impact Theory University. Until then, my friends, be legendary. Peace out.
What techniques do we have beyond that, things that are sort of the mental equivalent of going to the gym?
We want to practice it consistently. So starting there, this isn't the light switch. I like to say a lot of us, maybe discover consciousness. We know it's there. Maybe we've practiced once. Oh, I can use my attention. I can come here, be present. Yet we don't practice consistently enough. Even those of us with a meditation practice, where maybe that's the purpose of that 1 or 2 or 5 minutes where I'm sitting, my question always remains, what about the rest of your day? So
if you had to force rank the tools, so is meditation number 1, alarms are number 2, like what is the value stack of practicing attention?
Consciousness is the foundation. So whether or not you can develop your consciousness muscle by sitting as a sitting meditation, for some of us beginning, if I were to speak from my own experience, Tom, that was so overwhelming. My body didn't feel safe. My thoughts raced. I felt so agitated when I would try to sit silently that I actually began to build my consciousness muscle in real time, setting those alarms. Because I found that as I went about my day and my alarm went off, and say I was on a walk, being consciously present on my walk felt a little less intimidating. So I say that to say consciousness is the practice. We can develop it sitting in quiet, turning inward, or in real time. And those of us that feel a bit overwhelmed by the first practice can do it in anything we're doing. We can use any context, any activity, and use our focus of attention to be conscious.
I see you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You're somebody who obviously cares about martial arts and being able to fight and defend yourself. I've heard you talk very eloquently about violence, and clearly in your professional life, you've just what you've done in the writing, let alone the lecturing, you've already achieved such massive success. I refuse to believe that there wasn't a just massive amount of energy behind that. So how do you think about meditation in that context? Is this like going to war with your mind and I'm going to come out the other side having faced demons and having won some sort of victory that allows me to perform at a higher level? Or am I totally missing all of this and it needs to be a letting go, a more peaceful, relaxed, sort of transient experience?
Yeah, well, first, it's a very common association. I totally understand it. And it's presented in many ways where, yeah, you under that framing, you can just feel the testosterone leaving your body, So yeah, that's not my orientation. It is a lot like jujitsu for the mind, and it's a lot like it. I mean, what's so beautiful about jujitsu in particular is that you can have this massive effect in the domain of violence while being relaxed. It is what Aikido advertises itself to be, but it's a much more, at least in my estimation, a much more effective version of that same underlying ethic, where you can you can control someone and use as little violence as necessary, and basically just use a superior knowledge of physics and leverage and position against them. So it can be incredibly relaxed, and yet, given what the circumstance is, it can be a very high testosterone experience. It's a kind of quintessentially masculine thing to be doing, but you can internalize the same sort of structure, and that's largely what meditation is, because basically the default state is one of being attacked and ambushed all the time by your thoughts and by your reactivity, and by you are being taken in by assumptions and illusions, and not know you're in a fog, not you personally, but one is, and even when you learn to meditate, you're in this fog most of the time. I mean, and so the practice is one of continually breaking the spell. You are constantly on the mat, constantly finding yourself in a position of some surprising disadvantage, right? It's like all of a sudden there's a rear naked choke that's 3/4 applied, right? And you need an answer for that. And not knowing the answer is just synonymous with death.
What you eat, what you drink, what you take in, all of it matters so much. I'll even say lifestyle might be a better answer. So your diet is a huge portion of it, but your exercise routine is also critical. So if you know you have something stressful coming up, I'm going to recommend get your diet on point. Beyond the scope of this video to go into that, but I'll say really quickly, whole foods. Just eat whole foods. Things that look like it looked when it was walking around, or like it looked when it was in the ground. Okay? If you stick as close to that as humanly possible, you're going to be headed in the right direction. Then the next part is getting your exercise right. So actually working out, pushing yourself. And then, even more important than the exercise, is meditation. So you can actually change the structures of your brain by meditating. Let that land. You can change the physical structure of your brain by meditating. You become more emotionally resilient. You become more able to focus on a task over long periods of time. A lot of really fascinating things happen when you meditate. So if I were trying to preemptively self-soothe, that's exactly what I would do. Diet, exercise, and sleep. That's a critical part. And then meditation. Belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing changed my life. So I'd be curious to know what tools you use for that.
Yeah, so for a lot of us who struggle with our posture, it's hard.
So back straight, shoulders back?
So I started laying down. It was difficult for me. So I would begin my practice either right before bed or right when I woke up, when I was already laying. And for me, it started with just a small daily promise of 5 breaths from my deep belly area. For me, putting my hand on my belly physically so I could feel it when it would expand and when it would deflate was really helpful. So that was just a daily promise. Every time, every morning or right before bed, I would put my hand on my belly and just practice. But then, like I said, I wanted to become more aware of how I was using my breath all day long. And then building on that foundation, can I harness my breath all day long when now life's happening and I have the actual things to be stressed out about, right? Can I use my breath to regulate myself in those moments? So it becomes a foundational practice that we can build upon.
What I would be helping them do is create the pathway that requires the least amount of energy because the brain is hardwiring it. It's wrapping it in the myelin sheath so that the electrical signals are they're going more efficiently. And so the brain, from a caloric usage standpoint, is trying to do whatever is most efficient. And so simply through intelligent repetition, you're moving people into the default network of the brain so they can sort of fucking space out. And when they space out, they're becoming more calm. Their default reaction is the de-excitation of the nervous system.
Yeah. No, I like what I'm hearing. So the question is repetition, and I agree. It's not thinking about the mountaintop. You can, by the way you breathe, you can change the electricity in your mind. We've seen that with people we put grids on. Like, we have actual measurements now. But that's what's the structure where you get the most out of repetition? What is the perfect spot where meditative breathing hits that sweet spot for people? And they'll increase it if it continues to benefit them. But the food, the breathing, sleep is a hard one, but to me, food, what we eat, and meditative breathing, I think, are the most graspable and measurable. The creativity stuff, the sleep stuff, the exercise stuff is harder for people, but the exercise stuff is, in its own way, the most important, if we could get back to that.
Ooh, why?
Keeps your brain arteries open, releases all these neurotrophic factors inside your brain. So not just the plumbing that irrigates the flesh of the brain.
Tell me about
but
BDNF.
Actually, yeah, they're nerve growth factors. They're all neurotrophic factors, and whatever in this case, to be abbreviations, GDNF, BDNF, NGF, it doesn't matter. They end with GF, and growth factors. So it really is. I've heard your word miracle grow, but getting back to the garden analogy. To keep the flesh, we're going to get, electricity is one thing. To keep the flesh healthy, you have to irrigate it. And that has to do with your brain arteries. And since we already said it's not a ball, it's these, these jellyfish, and they're moving and they're throbbing and they're pulsating and their tentacles are reaching out. There's a lot of space in between. And that extracellular space, outside of the actual cells, outside of the neurons, outside of the jellyfish, if you will, it's not just water. There's chemicals floating around in there. Now, dopamine might be just from tentacle to tentacle, serotonin might be this way. But what's in all the stuff around all those billions and billions of neurons? They're growth factors and minerals and chemicals that the brain naturally has. But there's also a soup that these billions and billions of neurons are floating in. BDNF is a key component of that soup that helps regulate the health of each of those jellyfish or neurons.
And we can trigger more of that through exercise.
Yeah, you exercise and it releases it, it showers itself. It's not like the thigh muscle sends it up to the brain. The brain says, hey, I'm feeling good, this is good, I like this. I'm gonna create a new rut. I'm gonna remind you feel good when you run.
Well, I would just point out the mechanics of it, which is what is actually going on is that they're lost in thought. They're thinking without knowing that they're thinking basically every moment of their waking life, right? And the character of that story, in this case, is depressing or certainly productive of unhappiness. Now, there are at least three possible antidotes to that, and they should try all of them, right? So like if we're talking about a clinical depression, it's useful to say that there's a physiology to this that can be driven from below in a way that's not narrowly responsive to their thinking, right? So it'll tend to produce depressive thoughts, and the depressive thoughts will tend to feed back on the state. But I don't think all forms of depression are just a matter of what a person's thinking. I mean, it can be really, it's best viewed as a kind of disease, of physiology. And so, I'm not against antidepressants at all. I know many people who've, received a lot of help from them, and I hope we get better ones in the future. And pharmacology is definitely a piece of the solution for many people. And everything else that is good to do that people sort of lose their commitment to doing at the worst possible time should be done. I mean, you have to sort of get behind yourself and push. to exercise and to socialize and to do things that you may not want to do, because those are good for you and help can break you out of it. But the normal range of psychological suffering, not clinical depression, but just feeling like life sucks and you're a failure and there's nothing, it's like you're stuck. That is a story of telling yourself a story. You're thinking, and you can either become more and more mindful of that and interrupt that more and more, and it should be you can reframe this continually and tell yourself a better story, right? You can actually just engineer, you can change the code that you're running moment to moment. And I mean, just a very simple one, which I use, and I actually recently recorded this in a lesson on the app. Just gratitude, just thinking. This is actually, this particular maneuver is, I believe, comes from Stoic philosophy. I didn't actually get it from Stoic philosophy, but this sort of use of negative imagination, where you think of all of the bad things that haven't happened to you, right? So if you're just, if you're stuck in traffic, driving to the job that you don't like, and you're frustrated, you can think of all the things that could happen to you, right, that haven't. And if any one of them happened to you, you would consider your prayers answered if you could just be returned to this moment, right? Like, you haven't been diagnosed with cancer, right? You've got 2 young kids, say, you want to live to see them grow up, and you could be the guy who today is going to find out you've got 2 months to live, right? And you have to, then the next 2 months is spent just unwinding your worldly affairs, right? You're not that guy, right? That hasn't happened to you yet. That's just more thinking, but it can have a profound effect. You can reframe your experience in a way that doesn't actually change anything material about your circumstance, and it can let the light in. And there are many techniques like that that are just a matter of invoking useful concepts skillfully.
Step number 1, don't compare yourself to others in a way other than I could become that with enough time and energy and effort put into it. And then number 2, recognize that when you have a cognitive distortion like catastrophizing, I'll never be that good, right? You don't have evidence to support that. And even if you do, it does not serve you to spend time catastrophizing. So you are way better off, just from a neurochemical standpoint, you are way better off doing what's called a pattern interrupt, stopping yourself from thinking that. And instead of saying, so the nice simple pattern interrupt here, oh, I'm never going to be that good. Wait, pattern interrupt, I'm not that good yet, but I can get that good, okay? And that becomes the way that you break that cycle. And the only way to undo that anxiety is to let it atrophy. Now, the fastest way to make something atrophy is to focus on something else. So now the thing that we're going to replace that catastrophizing with, that's hardwiring into our brain, is we're going to replace it with the way the human animal works. I can get good at anything, right? So if it's what I call the only belief that matters. If I put time and attention into getting better at this thing, I will actually get better. That is the nature of the human animal. And so I would just repeat that. I can get good at anything. I can get good at anything. And so that becomes my pattern interrupt. That becomes the thing now that I'm reinforcing in my mind. That becomes the thought that hardwires. That becomes the feeling that hardwires. And now all of a sudden, when I encounter somebody that's doing something better than me, that's outpacing me, whatever the case, that's raising my anxiety levels, and I want to get back to that calm state, I'm going to pattern interrupt that, and I'm going to repeat now something that empowers me and makes me feel better. And by doing that, now I'm reinforcing something that makes me feel good, that makes me feel expansive versus contracting. So it makes me feel expansive, like I can tackle the challenge, and that's what I'm going to hardwire.